Hello, and welcome to the Living Well Show, the program that strives to empower adults to live life on their own terms. I am your host, Nicolette Hume, the Community Engagement Coordinator for the City of Lake Oswego Adult Community Center. Today, we will be talking about imposter syndrome. Have you ever found yourself feeling like an imposter or fraud in your own life? Or this feeling like you don't belong, or that it's only a matter of time before everyone finds out who you really are and aren't as great as everyone thinks you are? If you find yourself identifying with these thoughts, you are definitely not alone. In fact, many people we see as being the epitome of success actually at times feel like they too are imposters within their own life, and that feeling of them being not enough, or attributing their success to that of good luck or timing, and really devaluing the fact that their hard work and tenacity is what has paid off for them to be in that place of success. I would like to introduce today Dr. Kristen Casey, a clinical psychologist, author, social media contributor, speaker, and consultant. Her clinical interests include insomnia, borderline personality disorder, gender and sexuality exploration, and anxiety treatment for emerging adults. Her psychotherapy style includes utilizing evidence-based treatments and existential approaches to help her clients achieve a life full of fulfillment. Dr. Casey is known for her straightforward, down-to-earth approach with gentle humor. She is also the author of Life Lessons to Master Before You Die: Practical Ways to Achieve an Authentic Living Experience. And she is most known for being very active on social media and having over 130,000 followers on TikTok alone. She also has a highly sought after YouTube channel called Psych Thrive, and she uses her social media presence to shed light on mental health education and also provides directions for those who are seeking a career within psychotherapy. Welcome to the show today, Dr. Casey.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So you have kind of an interesting background. I will say, audience, she is reporting live from Kansas City. However, she grew up in New York, and she also had a career as an EMT before going into psychotherapy. So tell us what kind of transition that was, with not only going from an EMT and one day deciding to be a therapist to even moving to a place as random as the middle of the country.
Yeah, it's so interesting where life takes you, right? So I started off as an EMT for a local first aid squad. I was volunteering my time. At the time, I was in high school, and I had no idea what I was doing with my life. It was really difficult for me to identify exactly what would bring me joy. One of my friends said, "Hey, why don't you join the first aid squad with us? And it'll give you a sense of purpose." So I did. I ended up falling in love with it, and I did it for about 5 years. I also was a paid EMT on other first aid squads as well. What I learned on the ambulance was that we're all struggling with something, whether it's physically related, mentally related, emotionally related, and everybody is trying to seek some sort of purpose and connection in their life. So I did that for a little bit while I was in school. I got a bachelor's and master's degree. And from there, I became a mobile crisis counselor. I worked with individuals with intellectual disabilities as well, which I absolutely loved and I really miss a lot. And then from there, I wanted to be somewhere warm. So I looked at a map, and my husband and I, at the time, my boyfriend, we were looking and we were saying, where do we want to live? And we looked at Arizona because it seemed to have the warmest temperatures. And we just packed our bags and we drove out there with no jobs or anything. It was quite an experience, and I was very scared at the time. I also felt like an imposter. Like, what am I actually doing with my life? Like, I have no idea. At this point, I should know. We ended up getting into Phoenix, and he got a job, I got a job. I still kind of felt like I didn't know what I wanted to do. But I've always had this deep sense of wanting to connect with other people on a very, very vulnerable, deep level. I really value genuine human connection. So I applied to one doctorate program and I ended up getting in, and it was a huge life change for me. So I became a clinical psychologist, and I really, really focused a lot in my graduate studies on burnout and imposter syndrome. It's been really difficult for a lot of people who become doctors and lawyers, and if you're in a high position career, to feel like you actually are an expert, even if you know a lot of stuff. It also applies to people who, maybe don't even have careers. This applies to everybody, but that's how I got there. And then fast forward, we wanted to be closer to family, and I didn't want to go back to New York. So my husband, his family grew up here in Kansas City, so we decided to meet in the middle.
Wow. I definitely hear you on valuing that authentic human connection with people and having, there's a lot of small talk that happens, but it's a real treat when you're really able to connect with someone in a real way. And I totally admire just packing your bags and heading out west and seeing what it's all about.
It was scary. I was even thinking we brought our cat at the time, and we were feeding him on the way and hoping that he wouldn't be traumatized, and he's doing good still. So.
All right. Well, and when you talked about you yourself feeling like you had this sense of imposter syndrome, tell us a little bit more about what exactly is it? Because it seems like it could be identified in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, how I conceptualize imposter syndrome is perceived fraudulence. So you have this sense that you're a fraud. You have this sense that you're not able to actually perform whatever it is, the job duty or the role that you're trying to play. For example, you might have a career, right? You might have a doctorate degree in clinical psychology, right? And you might feel like you're doubting your abilities, and that you feel like, do I really have a doctorate degree? Is somebody really trusting me to provide psychotherapy to people? That's mostly what imposter syndrome stems from. It's disproportionately, like you were saying before, not valuing what you bring to the table and really focusing on potentially luck or some external experience that has gotten you to this point, when in fact it mostly is because of all the hard work that you've put into it.
So even though imposter syndrome is something that people are dealing with, the DSM does not categorize it as a type of, or how does the DSM look at it? Because as far as I know, it's not in there. It's more of a modern phenomena.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because when I look at the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it categorizes certain things. And there's a little bit of research out there and talk, I guess, in the community about how it's not exactly inclusive and there's a lot of bias, right? So bias in the sense of there are other things that people are experiencing that aren't necessarily in the DSM. Imposter syndrome is one of them, people who are extremely highly sensitive, and things like that. So I think of imposter syndrome as an experience that people have, but it's not necessarily a mental health disorder. If I could create the DSM and could create this all myself, I would definitely put it in there, because it could really affect people. And when we think of a mental health diagnosis, we think of it affecting certain areas of life, multiple areas of life, such as school, relationships, social endeavors, things like that. And imposter syndrome does have the ability to weed itself into these things. People with imposter syndrome sometimes feel like, wow, I'm not performing my job effectively, or even as a friend, it's really difficult for me to show up when I'm doubting myself.
So would you say that this kind of could branch or attach itself to different disorders? Like, let's say someone who is having a lot of, it's almost like within the category of self-doubt. And let's say they really start to ruminate about it, to the point where it could go hand in hand with obsessive compulsive, or is there other types of mental health diagnosis that this can attach itself to as well?
That's a really good question. I think about comorbidity, and I think about who is more likely to experience imposter syndrome. And we do know that it disproportionately affects high achieving people. And high achieving people usually, and I say usually lightly, might have a little bit of anxiety, might have OCD-like tendencies. Not all of us, but some of us. So I think that there is some sort of correlation, although I would like to look at the research more deeply.
Well, and I almost wonder too, is this something that has always existed within, just human behavior throughout time? Or is this kind of a modern phenomena where you can take someone, let's say someone who writes a book, and literally it becomes Oprah's, book of the year, and they are an overnight success and everybody wants a piece of them. Or it could be someone on social media that it takes off, and it's just like we're not made to have that level of focus on us. Like, is this maybe why we are seeing more of it or hearing more of it from what we deem as highly successful people?
I love how you brought that up because I haven't quite thought of it in that way. I think you make a really good point about when people have like newfound fame, or, they're put into a position where they use their skills in a different way, or like you said, like the highlights around them. Sometimes we don't quite know how to handle that. It actually happened to me with TikTok. I had one video that blew up pretty much overnight, and I looked at my phone and I was like, I don't think I was meant to be in the limelight like this, and I was feeling all this imposter syndrome of like, am I really cut out to do this? Even though I have had great training and I'm really good at what I do, right? But I was doubting it in those moments of being in a new space, a new experience.
So if someone, we're talking about the self-doubt aspect, but what are other characteristics associated with this type of syndrome?
Self-doubt is definitely a big one. Another one that I would quantify at least, or qualify as a category of it, would be like an inability to realistically assess your competence and skills. So you're probably good at what you do, but you attending to those things and identifying those things as true might be difficult at the time. Like you said, you might attribute your success to external factors. So you're not attributing it to the work that you've put in or your inherent ability to do those things. Some people are naturally just smart, right? They have a knack for things. They have a higher IQ. So they might actually attribute their success to external things rather than their IQ or something like that. Another thing would be berating your performance, or getting down on yourself about how you've been performing, even if you've been performing at par or above par. Overachieving is another symptom. Sometimes it's a compensatory strategy to deal with imposter syndrome. Some people say, oh, I don't know if I'm good at what I'm doing, so I'm going to go above and beyond and do even more just so that I could prove myself to myself or others. Another one is sabotaging your own success. I see a lot of that, of people saying, oh, I'm so successful and, I've been doing all these great things, but do I really deserve this? Do I really need to be in this space right now? Another one is expectations. So fear that you won't meet your expectations that you set out for yourself or other people. Other people might have expectations for you. For example, if you're a TV host, right? People might have expectations of performance and how you show up, right? So you might think, oh gosh, I have to show up in a certain way. Or as a psychologist, every time I see a client, I might have to meet myself at this high, potentially unrealistic expectation. And then one of the last ones that I usually talk about is, setting very challenging goals and then feeling very disappointed when you fall short. So you might feel, I want to overcompensate and I want to overachieve. And I'm going to do that by setting all these very, very unrealistic goals. And when I don't meet them, I'm really going to get down on myself. But overall, imposter syndrome could look very different for every person because everybody is different. But I think these are the main ones that I look for.
Well, and some of the things that you talk about, it sounds like if we were to look at different types of personalities, let's say type A, type B, that maybe type A people tend to experience this more than others. At least that's what it sounds like to me. But again, I'm no psychologist, I don't know. But then also, what is the deal with self sabotage? Why is that something that seems to kind of pop its head up in so many different areas of people's lives, and it affects, many different types of people? Why do we do that to ourselves?
Oh my gosh, question of the year, really. When I think, really, it's a good one because it's so multifaceted, right? There's so many. I love questions like this because there's just so many different areas that we could go down. We could probably talk about this for days. But I think self sabotage sometimes comes from your inability to see your worth. And if you feel that you might be unworthy or that you're not deserving of certain things, you might unconsciously or consciously self sabotage. And for example, people who have maybe they're in school and they might say, oh, I'm just going to not go to school and I'm just going to, not do these assignments and just take the L here, even though they're probably really, really good at what they do. They're probably killing it. They're probably doing great. But they might think, I'm not deserving of this. Or, they might compare themselves to others. Like there are people out there who don't have this opportunity. Maybe they're recognizing their privilege. And sometimes with that comparison, it's hard to identify our worth. So I think personally, I think it's very connected to a sense of self-worth and connection to your identity and self. There's so many other things that might be at play here. Sometimes people also self-sabotage because they have this tendency to think that, in the future, is this actually what I want? I'm trying to futurize and I'm trying to think of the future and I'm not exactly sure if this is in the cards for me or if I could handle it. So they might sabotage it early so that they don't have to deal with disappointment, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Which kind of comes back to our desire for control. Where
it
it's
always
like,
is there, right?
it is. It's like, well, rather than feeling out of control and not knowing when the ball is going to drop, I'm just going to drop it on my foot right now and just call it what it is.
Yeah, totally.
And it's just so sad that we do that to ourselves. And the other thought I had too is when you're talking about self-worth, I think about how child rearing or our ideas around it and how parents these days are so much more involved in their children's lives that I really am kind of curious to see where this goes in terms of self-worth, because there's a lot more children growing up these days in comparison to that of our parents or grandparents, where they are just inundated with love and care, and maybe what some experts consider too much. So I'm kind of curious where this will kind of go, in the next 20 to 30 years, and if there will be an impact there, just because previous generations, it just was, I don't know, children were to be seen and not heard, and now it's children are to be heard and seen, so I'm kind of curious about that, just on a side note.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that all the
that.
time. I think about that all the time, honestly, and I think of the different parenting styles. So there's like authoritative parenting, there's authoritarian parenting, right? So there's all these different types of parenting styles, and I noticed that children who are reared from authoritative parents, they tend to, have a lot of esteem, a relatively good amount of esteem, meaning they recognize their growth edges, but they also recognize the good things that they have going on for them because their parents remind them. So as a comparison, so authoritarian parents are potentially cold, distant, but they also have a lot of rules. They're very strict with their children. Authoritative parents also have those same rules, but they're very warm and open, and they create space for conversations about, growth, love, self-worth, all those things. They're a little more receptive, in my opinion, to those conversations. Not to say one's worse than the other. We do notice that children have different trajectories when they're raised differently. Among other things, there's also hereditary components and all these other things at play. But I do wonder too about parenting styles, self-worth, and I also, like you said, the generational differences. I mean, gosh, I can't imagine growing up back in the day, right? So right now, I think parents are really doing a great job. I have a lot of respect for parents in general. I think it's not easy to take a piece of your heart out, give it to a child and hope that they handle it with care, right? And hope the world handles them with care as well. So,
amen to that. And thank you. As a mom to a teenager and a much younger son, it is. It's like, and maybe on a personal note, I think for myself, in regards to imposter syndrome, not growing up with, let's say, a mother that was very, what would you say, more authoritarian in nature. When I became a
authoritative,
parent,
yeah.
yes, when I became a parent at a young age, I personally was in college, but I remember thinking, am I doing it right? Like, I don't know how to do this. And it wasn't so much doubting my ability to love and care. It was like not having seen a person in my life do it with such grace and openness and like a sense of joy or fulfillment. Maybe that's expecting too much, but and so when I became a parent, it was like, I don't know if I know how to do this. No one has shown me. And at times doubting my own ability and the fact that he turned out to be a dang good kid. I'm like, wow, how did you do that? Even
Exactly.
to
Like
this
you were
day, I'm
doubting
like,
yourself,
how did
right?
that happen? Yeah, absolutely. I probably give him way more credit than I give myself in that regards, but I know that I'm not alone in that. That there's definitely other mothers out there who have experienced the same thing, or even as a working mother and wanting to have the best of both worlds. You know, am I showing up in the way that I'm hoping to, or like you could be really successful at your job and feel like everything's going, 100%, but maybe at home things aren't as, you know, what would you say? Things aren't functioning and at its highest potential because it's like you can kind of vacillate between the two. You could be having wonderfulness at home and maybe at work it's so, and it's just always like this ebb and flow and that whole work life balance. But emotionally, you feel torn, especially as a mom. I know there are times that I do feel that sense of being torn.
I love that you brought up the concept of, working moms and this tendency to feel like, am I doing enough? And am I showing up? I love how you described it. Am I showing up the way that I intend to show up? And I think with imposter syndrome, we might have intentions, right, to show up a certain way. And maybe we're not because of other things in our life. I mean, there's so many stressors, especially I think being around the concept of being a parent, right? When you're a parent, you not only have to parent and do all the parental duties, you also have a relationship with yourself. You potentially have a relationship with your partner. Maybe you have a job. Maybe you have friends. So there's always going to be, in my opinion, an area of your life that doesn't feel as fulfilling or it's not up to par based on your own expectations. And rightfully so. You can't do everything all the time. But I think about it this way, like there's also this tendency for comparison. And I think that's really what drives imposter syndrome sometimes is the thought of other people are doing exactly what I'm doing, but they're doing it better and they're doing it with grace, like you mentioned. And how can I get there? But we're seeing a very small blip of potentially what people are doing and how they're showing up. And we're using that as a guide we're using that as a guide for our own expectations. And that's usually where we fail. And when imposter syndrome just has us has us in a chokehold at that point, because if you're comparing yourself to a mom on social media, right, who's doing all these things and she feels like she has endless energy, it's going to feel difficult when you have low energy and when you're struggling.
Oh, absolutely. And it's really interesting too because I've been looking online recently and seen a lot of people saying that they're taking a break from social media and kind of putting that post out there. I'm seeing that more than ever before. and adults of all ages. So I find that to be really kind of fascinating. And it's been recently, like within the last month or two. But yeah, we have these curated lives that we put out there for everyone to think that we're doing great, or even the whole even on a self-identity level, like let's say in regards to ethnic identity. Like for myself, I'm American Indian, and I could also see, because it's Native American month, but there's a lot of people that are being shown that are out there, and even for someone like myself or other people with other different identities, whether it's ethnic or sexual or just anything under the sun, you can feel like, I don't quite identify with that. Does that make me less? Does that make my value not as important, or my contribution, is that not seen as acceptable? So I do see some of that as well, personally, and then also for other people.
I think that's a great point, because if we are having trouble with self-identity and how we're perceiving ourselves, and potentially focusing on how we're perceived, it could feel very, very isolating, especially when we're dealing with imposter syndrome. And I love how you brought up race and ethnicity. And I think about it on the spectrum, right? Of how do we want to identify? How do we identify? I should say, how do we identify? And how does that make me feel in a room full of people who identify similarly? Do I feel less than? Do I feel equal to? Do I feel like I'm over-identifying? Because there might be this tendency to, again, compare, right? And I think, especially for people of color and for minorities, it's really difficult to feel included in general, right? So we put that on top of imposter syndrome, and on top of this tendency to say, I'm not even sure if I belong. I mean, it could be very stifling.
Oh, absolutely. And then another thing too is, since we're, talking about, self-identity, self-worth, what are some, how do we identify it within our lives, and what are some of the causes of imposter syndrome within our lives?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I'll start with the causes. So the research out there, if I could do a meta-analysis and present you with the results, that would be ideal. But based on my clinical experiences and reading the research, it's a couple of things. So I like to look at personality traits, specifically perfectionism, type A personalities, like you were talking about. Conscientiousness is another one. People who have a tendency toward perfectionism, or they're highly conscientious, they are more likely to be in tune with their own identity and be more in tune with their accomplishments. So not to say people who aren't perfectionists aren't, but we do notice that, especially in career-driven professionals. Also, family background is a big play of the causes of imposter syndrome. So there might be families that value achievement over anything else. They might value, you achieving a certain status or a certain thing in your life. And this could be, becoming a doctor. It could be becoming a mom, right? There's all these pressures on younger people now too, to perform and to be a part of humanity in a different way, or in a valuable way, I guess. So depending on your upbringing and what messages you were told, and based on your own personality disposition, I think those are two big things to consider as we look at imposter syndrome. I noticed too that people who have a tendency to have balanced thinking usually are able to battle imposter syndrome a little easier. For example, if you're able to see your shortcomings and then also see the things that you're good at, it's a little easier to see the big picture. If people are hyper-focused on the negative or hyper-focused on the things that they're doing wrong, they're going to have this tendency to want to overachieve.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think too, you probably see more people who don't have the balanced thinking mind, which is a lot of people I know.
Me too, everybody.
Myself.
So, yeah, we all do it.
how are you being so nice to yourself? Like that just seems impossible.
That's where I compare myself. I'm like, my internal dialogue is negative, but when we look at the research, our brains are depending on what research you look at. I mean, our brains are geared for survival. So if there is anything negative or if there is a threat, our brain is going to attach to that because it wants us to survive. I mean, a threat in the 21st century is a little different than a threat back in hunter-gatherer days. I mean, we're not being chased by bears in our own house, right? So I think the threats now are, am I living up to my fullest potential? Am I in financial debt? Is my relationship on the rocks? Do I have a good relationship with my children? So those are the threats for people nowadays that cause them to think negatively, rightfully so. I mean, life is very difficult. So,
well, and I think too, when you're talking about like family expectations and such, I think about two things. One is that there have been, previous generations, like say there is a family that is successful and the previous generations prior to it took all that hard work for that person to reach a certain level of success. So people having children these days, it's like, well, I don't want you to have to go through all these things or, all these adversities. So we are able to make this happen for you. And it's done out of love and care for this person's future or this child's future. But I can definitely see how it comes to this identity put upon young people and feeling burdened by those expectations. So I find that part to be kind of interesting. And then also the thought of, well, how much of what we're putting on ourselves is actually us? Where
that's the big
where
question.
do
Yeah.
we begin and where does that other stuff start?
It's hard to know. Yeah, it's hard to know. And I think unless there's a lot of intentional focus on identifying where these things come from, we might never know, right? So I always suggest to my clients and my friends and my family and whoever will listen to me to say, take some time throughout your day and just reflect. Reflect on the day, reflect on your emotions, and also reflect on how far you've come. Because without reflection, you could just be in this constant state of going and going and going, and then you won't recognize the path. The path might feel blurry or it's not clear enough for you. But if you're able to reflect on things, you might say, oh, that's a message that I got from my mom, or that's a message that my dad told me that probably wasn't good advice, or maybe it was helpful back then, but it sure is not helpful now. So I always like to try to think of a rationale too for if I am thinking negatively and if I am feeling this sense of pressure, where is it coming from? Is it self-perceived pressure or is it pressure from my family? And regardless of where it comes from, is it helpful? I noticed that the pressure that I had in my family specifically, I'm the only woman and only person in my family who's gotten a doctorate degree, who's gotten higher education. And I grew up in New York and it was difficult. And my parents just said, we hope you survive, do your best. We love you, but just figure it out. They were nice and supportive, but I didn't have much direction. And I noticed that I didn't have much pressure, but I know that I didn't want to be like them. I love them so much and I wanted something different for myself. So that was the pressure that I put on myself. And that's pretty much the thing that kept me going was I don't want to create a life for myself that's going to be a replica of a prior generation because I don't want to go through that pain. So for me, that was the fuel for the fire. And I noticed that was helpful to a certain degree. Now that I have my degree and I, work with people and I'm really good at what I do and I just love what I do, I could let go a little bit of that pressure and fuel it into something else, like spending time with friends and family. So,
yeah, I completely identify with you on that. Having, been the first in the family to really pursue higher education and having a family that was kind of like, good luck with that. And all that entails because as a young person, you just feel like, what am I getting myself into? And you put a lot of pressure on yourself to achieve such things. And especially you going to the level of a doctorate, that is a lot. So I really admire you for that. I really do. And the
thank
fact
you.
that
Yeah.
you pay it forward in providing these resources for people who are wanting to pursue that, because people do have a lot of questions. Is this something that I want to do? Or how do I even do it? Coming from places like ourselves, we didn't necessarily, we had probably to learn the hard way as we went through that process.
Definitely.
But
Yeah.
in
Go ahead.
regards to imposter syndrome, does it affect one gender more than the other? Because I saw that there are studies out there, they mostly looked at women, saying women experience this more than men, but that was just because they studied women. But it sounds like it may affect both men and women equally. Could you talk a little bit more
That's a
about
good
that?
call. Yeah, that's a good call. The research is a little biased in their selection samples, at least what I notice. And I notice too with the colleagues that I talk to and the people that I talk to, it does affect everybody. The one thing that I've noticed, which I wanna research a little more, is I do notice imposter syndrome affects people of color, minorities a little more, and I'm still trying to dig deeper into that. I'm coming from a white perspective here, right? So I really want to learn more about that and see how I can help my clients as best I can. Because we do know that people who are trying to either achieve things or make a life that's better for themselves, we all have different starting lines, based on privilege, socioeconomic status, all those things. So I think in terms of gender, I see it pretty much across the board. And then I always like to look at the intersection between not only gender, but race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, all those things. So I do like to look at all of it. And I noticed that women are studied more than men, and I'm not exactly sure why when it comes to imposter syndrome, but I wonder if it's this tendency, and again, this isn't validated by research, it's just my pure thoughts, is I wonder if women have a higher likelihood of, looking inward and kind of looking at like, hey, what do I bring to the table? Do I have to keep going? Women sometimes also have multiple roles in families and in life. You're a parent, you're a working mom, you're a daughter, sister, all those things. There are plenty of men out there who have multiple roles too. So just hypothetical questions here.
Oh, absolutely. And I do wonder, and again, as you stated, this is my own pure thought, but in regards to, um, you know, identity and people of color, I think one thing that can be hard is there is also a phenomena of internal racism. So let's say you could be part of you as a certain race or ethnicity, and the other part of you is, let's say, white. Well, within one culture, the ethnic culture can be like, well, you're not really one of us. But then in the white culture, it's like, you're definitely not one of us. So that person can kind of feel like you're in a no man's land of, well, then where do I really fit in if both cultures don't fully accept me? And trying to figure that out, or maybe the ethnicity percentage is growing smaller by the generation, but that person may still heavily identify with a certain culture representation that, again, it can just kind of be this no man's land for people. Or society can say, well, we are wanting to promote people of color, but it's like, but you don't look ethnic enough, for us, or what have you, or what we deem as typical, or you can almost be stereotyped in that way, I guess you could say. And I'm saying this
Absolutely.
as, an American Indian woman who is half Native and half white, and I totally
Mm-hmm.
identify with that. But that's just a little food for thought, people.
Yeah, I think
We don't have to
again,
take my word for it.
yeah, I love these conversations though, because I think, like you said, depending on how you identify and how you perceive yourself and then how others perceive you, I mean, it could be extremely confusing, extremely confusing.
Yeah.
So I even think about it too in terms of career, right? So if I'm in a doctorate program and my colleague is a black colleague, a black woman in a doctorate program, we're going to have two completely different experiences in terms of how we feel like we fit in. And just say there's another person who has multiple, identifications about how they feel like they're perceived and how they perceive themselves. That's even more confusing for them. Where do I fit? Who do I talk to? How do I compare myself to my cohort in terms of how I'm doing, right? And with imposter syndrome, it's even more difficult because you just don't really know where the bar is sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. And that's another thing. Does this seem to affect more people at a certain age than another? Like, is there a particular age group that you are seeing this more than others?
I notice it more in emerging adulthood, which is technically 19 to 26, I think. Don't quote me on that. I'll have to look at that up. But it's this transition phase between childhood, adolescence, and right before adulthood, technically. Every time I see someone who's 18, I'm like, you're an adult. I'm not trying to say you're not. There's just an emerging adulthood phase where there's a transition in terms of life, career, all these things. And we notice that people who are a little older, they've gained mastery in certain aspects of their life, and gaining mastery increases confidence, and increased confidence usually helps diminish imposter syndrome. So when we notice that people have gained mastery in some areas of their life, if they are dealing with like a novel experience, meaning becoming a grandmother or, changing careers at 50 or 60 or something like that, they might be better equipped to handle those changes and those transitions because they've dealt with something potentially similar and they could like generalize their experience. I notice people who are a little younger, especially our Gen Z right now, who are dealing with a lot. They do feel like imposters right now because everything is new. Everything is something that they haven't technically dealt with before. Even though they're pretty well equipped emotionally, it could feel like they don't know what they're doing and they feel like a fraud.
Well, and the interesting idea too is that 19 to 26, and this is something that is not identified by the DSM, but it has seemed as though that if someone is going to have some type of mental health diagnosis or crisis or something related to that in general it tends to make its first emergence around that time. Is that correct?
Depending on the diagnosis and depending on multiple factors, of course, but we do notice that around that time, yes. Specifically, when I think about schizophrenia, when I think of bipolar disorder, when I think of personality disorders, they usually tend to make their appearance in terms of getting in the way of life during those times. And I'm not sure if it's because of the traditional trajectory of these things, or if it's life is presenting you with multiple transitions, and now you really have to put your fuel is basically to the fire, and you have to figure it out. And stress increases and all that stuff, which might make symptoms more apparent. But yeah, we do notice a lot of symptoms do emerge during that time.
And I can definitely see exactly what you're talking about because that's when life gets really interesting for everybody.
It gets hectic. Yeah, it gets hectic. I mean, you're trying to figure your life out. You don't know what you're doing. So
yeah, and some of our greatest heartaches can be at that time, or the first of maybe many for some people, unfortunately. I also wanted to ask you, there seems to be, it's not just imposter syndrome, but there's like a handful of different kinds. What are they? And it just seems overwhelming.
I agree. So when you reached out to me, I was like, how am I even going to have time to talk about all the different types? But I could talk about the ones that I see the most of. The first one I think we touched on a little bit of was the perfectionist. So these people are, they experience imposter syndrome in a way of, even if they get a 99% out of 100, that still is a failure. So it's very like all or nothing. When I think of all or nothing thinking, it's technically one of those cognitive distortions that most of us engage in when we're dealing with stress or when we're just dealing with life. If it's not exactly how I intended it to be, I failed. So when you experience imposter syndrome and you use this evidence, right, based on your history of, hey, I got a 99% out of 100 all these times, that means they're all failures. You discount all the things that you do well, which fuels imposter syndrome, which I find very interesting. So That's definitely one of them. The other one is the expert. So people who feel, the quality of their knowledge needs to be at 100%, right? It has to be, they have to know everything. They have to know all the facts. Saying I don't know is very uncomfortable for them. And if they say I don't know, then that means I'm an imposter, I'm a fraud, I don't know what I'm talking about. When in fact, there are plenty of experts out there who still don't know everything, and that's totally normal. My grandmother was telling me one time, she's like, even if you are a total expert in this one field, it's pretty much impossible for you to know every single thing about every single thing at all times and be able to regurgitate that to somebody else. So I think people who are able to say, I don't know the answer to that question, and I have to look at the research, and I have to, let me get back to you on that. It doesn't necessarily mean you don't know what you're doing. It just means that you value what you're doing so much to the point where you're willing to take a deeper look. And, that could really set people down when they have imposter syndrome, especially that type. Another type is the superwoman or superman, and I wish they would add a non-binary one into this, but they feel like they're phonies they feel like they're phonies amongst their colleagues. So they want to do everything. It's like that person in the group project who does everything and doesn't let anybody do anything else because they want to show that they know what they're doing. It's more of a comparison experience for people. Like, my colleagues are doing all of this stuff, and I need to show them that I know what I'm doing, when in fact, them just showing up as they are and contributing in a natural way would probably be perfect and would be completely fine and satisfactory for what they're doing. And the last one that I normally think of is people who are like the natural genius. I think we talked a little bit before about people with high IQs. So people who have like a natural instinct for intelligence. They expect to be intelligent coming out of the womb, right? 8 pounds, 6 ounces, they want to know everything. So I think people who are natural geniuses, if they have a moment, it's similar to the expert, where if they have moments where they don't know something or it's not coming clearly to them or they're dealing with stress, it really gets down on them pretty hard because they don't exactly know what's going on. They question themselves. Those are the 4 that I see the most of. I don't know if you've seen any others in your time or, in your life that you want to talk about, but I'm always interested to see what other people bring.
The thing I keep thinking is when we look at, the global scene, I really wonder if there are other countries outside of America that have high rates of this or not, because I think, we're just such a highly driven society and not shy about putting ourselves out there. And we have the meccas of entertainment like New York City and Hollywood. And I just see this, I just keep thinking, is this an American thing? Is there other countries that really struggle with this? Because there are definitely different attitudes towards certain things, or differing attitudes that other countries have as a culture that doesn't sound like this. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. What do you think?
I wonder about the same thing, because every country and every culture has different norms, right? And different standards for what they perceive as inherently good and bad. And I wonder if there's a difference between like individualistic and collectivistic cultures. That's the one thing I'm thinking about right now, of people who have this tendency in collectivistic cultures to not shame the family and to really do a good job so that their whole family, benefits from it. And people who are more individualistic, they might have a tendency to value their own individual experiences over that of the family or the collective culture. And then I'm thinking, I'm just talking out loud here, I'm wondering if either way you might experience some sort of imposter syndrome, because even if you're embedded within a culture that values, collectivism, I wonder if, the imposter syndrome comes from not being enough for that group. And then if it's individualistic, you're not enough for yourself,
Yeah. Yes, I can definitely see how those two could play into being, and having each their own, burdens to bear for the individual or the group. But I will say, as our time is kind of coming to an end, and it's gone by so fast.
That went by way too fast.
It really did. And I'm, what could you possibly share as words of wisdom for people who are like, you know what? I'm really identifying with a lot of what Dr. Casey is saying. What can I do about it? How can I, find solutions to be more kind to myself and, reach out for help? What would you suggest?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts. I think the first one is something that you hit on with self-compassion. So Dr. Kristen Neff does a lot of work with self-compassion, and I think that's really the core of identifying that your experience is similar to the overall human experience. Like what you're struggling with might not specifically be the same as someone else, but the overall pattern might be the same, and that includes imposter syndrome. So selfcompassion.org or self-compassion.org. I used a lot of Kristen Neff's work in my dissertation for self-compassion. I think it's great. So that would be where I would start. If you want to go a little deeper, there's a lot of other things that I would suggest. I would suggest 4 things. So the first one is identifying in relation to imposter syndrome, is this a skill acquisition issue? Am I able to up my skills in this one area to make me feel better about my performance? That might be at a job or being a parent or doing anything really. The second would be, how comfortable do I feel in this area of my life? A lot of times discomfort fuels imposter syndrome. So becoming more comfortable with discomfort is helpful, and it's easier said than done, of course. The third would be incorporating any feedback that you've received from anybody. So obviously with a grain of salt, depending on where it's coming from, right? But if someone has told you, hey, I'm a mom and I've tried this one thing before, maybe it'll help you, wouldn't it be a bad idea to just take a deeper look, right? And be curious about that. And then the last thing, which I think is the most important, is developing a really strong opinion of yourself. And I think sometimes we tend to cringe when people say, oh, that means that you're overly confident or you're cocky or something like that. You're the only one living your life. So you may as well feel good about yourself, So when you develop a really strong opinion of yourself, imposter syndrome really doesn't have a leg to stand on because you feel really good about what you're doing. So that would be what I would suggest to start with.
I think that I will be doing some of those things.
I do it too all the time. I have to check myself. Yeah.
Yes, because I think really in a lot of what I've seen a lot of people do in their careers is they are helping to give to those also what we need to give back to ourselves, and too, that there is a mutual healing that can take place in our work, no matter what it is, no matter what type of job that we have. I think there's always something personal there for all of us. So thank you so much for coming on our show today, Dr. Casey. I have absolutely enjoyed this. It's given me a lot to think about personally. And I hope that you've enjoyed your time on our show today.
I really appreciate your time so much. And thank you for sharing part of your story too. It really inspired me. So thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. And, for everyone today, I hope that you really garnered some great information about what to do in regards to imposter syndrome and how it may show up in your own life, or maybe how it has possibly shown up in your life before, and really kind of think about that and know that you're not alone. A lot of people feel that in a variety of different ways, whether it's that really confident person in the boardroom to someone who is just a mom trying to figure it out on her own. Know that you're not alone, and there are definitely resources out there to help you and support you. That's it for today. I am your host, Nicolette Hume. Thank you for being a part of our community. And as always, be kind, be safe, and always stay curious. Take care.